Well, hey everybody. Before we watch this week's video, I want to introduce to you Ms. Abby Langlois, who comes to us from Cobourg, Ontario. This is Abby's first teaching, and if you haven't watched the video explaining who the teachers are, it's going to be up in one of these click banners up in here, you know, those things that appear in the top of your YouTube videos. But with that, pass it over to you, Abby. Sure glad she's with us.
In life, I think it's super important to have people in your circles that speak into your life, that help guide you, train you, correct you, and encourage you. These can be a number of people: parents, older siblings, teachers, pastors, mentors. In the passage that we read today, we are getting an inside look at one of these mentoring relationships. The Apostle Paul has met Timothy, a promising young leader that he sees so much potential in. Paul has spent time mentoring Timothy and teaching him what it means to be a good leader. This letter that we're reading shows a continuation in teaching Timothy what it means to be a good leader. So first, Paul talks about money and contentment, two subjects that are so important to talk about because these things can become incredible blocks in our ability to live good lives. We get so caught up in the chase after money or in our own discontentment that we actually disable our ability to live full, happy lives. Timothy is currently working with the church in Ephesus, a church that has quite a few issues. They had false teachers who were trying to corrupt what people knew about Jesus and manipulate his words in order to bring more profit in for them and elevate their own status in society. Paul writes to Timothy about this to remind Timothy what is actually true about money, which is something that we're going to get to a little bit later on. The second thing that Paul does is leave some final instructions to his mentee, Timothy. He's giving this beautiful speech about what it means to live a life that is honoring to God. And this is a speech that I encourage you to reflect on this week as you continue on in this back to school season. And maybe it's going to help reshape how life looks like for you and your family. Finally, Paul brings it back and talks about what it means for us to have a lot and how to be generous with what we have. He talks about being wise with what we've been given and that our money should be used to do good. There's a lot that we could talk about in this passage, and I hope that in your groups you dive into all sorts of things that are brought up within this passage. But in the time that we have together, I want to talk about just a couple things. The first thing that I want to point out is how Paul instructs Timothy that we need to be content with our finances and our possessions. As a 20-something that is still paying off the loan she got for her undergrad, I can tell you that this is not always something that is easy for me to do. I actually struggle with this a lot, but I also think that a lot of us have to face this in our own ways. And so let's take a deeper look. Paul is using this letter to Timothy as instructions for life and for church. As I said earlier in this chapter, he is putting out a warning against listening to false teachers, people who have wrong motives for teaching and are going against what Jesus has said. He then moves into where we start reading, where he talks about contentment. Paul knows that it's easy for money to become the main focus of our life. And this is true for so many of us. Maybe it's not just for things like the newest iPhone or the newest pair of sneakers or a brand new car. Maybe money has become the main focus for things like home repairs, debt, saving, and investments. Let's be clear here. I don't want you to get the idea that as you read this, now it's time to pull all the money out of investments and never focus on them, or that we can never purchase a new iPhone, because that's not what's being said here. What Paul is telling Timothy is to not let these things become an obsession, to rule over his life, if you will. We can become so focused on making the right investments that we actually miss out on life because we are too focused on making money. We can become so focused on saving for that new thing that we want that we actually miss out on what's going on around us. Sometimes our external wants and our external desires can trap us. They can make us forget what the most important things in life are. Craving money, as Paul describes it, can cause us to break our focus on what's important in life. Money is good. It's a tool that is useful and is helpful. It's exciting to save, it's exciting to spend, and it's exciting to give. But it was never designed to take over our lives, but instead be used as a tool. It's in this part of scripture that Paul says a phrase that has become very popular in society, but is very often misquoted. He says, "The love of money is the root of all evil." Notice that he's not saying that money is simply the root of all evil, but that it's our love of money that's the root of all evil. The love that breeds discontentment and comparison. The love that makes us greedy. The love that holds back and hoards. That's what's at the root of evil, not the actual money itself. And if we jump to the last section of the passage of scripture, we see Paul give Timothy one more final instruction about money. He says, don't put your trust in money. Money is unreliable. If you've ever paid attention to the news lately, you know that it fluctuates. So many things affect our money. Paul's intention with this letter to Timothy is to help guide him on how he can teach the church in Ephesus what is really the heart of God, to fight against the bad teachings that have come from these false prophets. And in the case of money and contentment, Paul knows that these things have soul ties. Money and our desire for wealth impacts us on an emotional, a physical, and a spiritual level. The impact that money has on individuals is unlike so many others. For all the high school students that are watching, because I love being able to talk to you guys, I know what it's like to feel like everyone else has everything you want and that you will never be able to get there. You take a look at social media, I take a look at social media, and we're able to see at any given time what everyone else has. It's hard to think about it. But trust me, every single adult in the room has struggled with this comparison at some point and in some way. You aren't alone in this. I think it's important for us to take a look at verse 9. But people who long to be rich fall into temptation and are trapped by many foolish and harmful desires that plunge them into ruin and destruction. Having wealth is not an issue. Maybe you've been wise with money and you have quite a bit saved. Maybe you have a great paying job. There's a number of ways that you might have wealth. And this is not bad. It's when we let the desire of being wealthy and never being satisfied with what we have that is the issue. Jesus is calling us to a life that is worth so much more than our possessions. He's asking us to live a life that pursues righteousness, faith, love, and gentleness. He's asking us to desire those values over stuff that we might want. And this happens as we learn to be his followers and to value him above all things. When we do this, it's here that the fruit of contentment and wholeness is produced in us as we learn to put our trust in him to supply our needs and to take off the burden of being self-dependent. And as you move into your groups, I'd love to know, what do you think? What stood out to you today, and how can you apply this to your life?